I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about how war made monsters out of men.
The Japanese soldier forced water down my throat, placed a board across my stomach, and jumped on it. Water came out every opening of my body.
I want to tell you a story about why and how the Malayan Chinese suffered under Japanese colonial rule.
You already dug a big hole under the present McDonald building so that they make them walk into this jungle. Ask them to stand near all the big holes. They shoot them one by one, and the body will drop into the big hole.
My name is Li-Lian. I am a Malaysian Chinese. Will you listen to the story of my people's life? In 1942, fresh from the war against China in 1937, Japanese troops arrived in Malaya. And I say Malaya and not Malaysia because back then we were just the peninsular part, bordering Thailand, and East Malaysia wasn't part of us yet. And here's what the Japanese kind of thought of us back then. So here I'm playing you a voice acting of Watanabe Wataru's memoirs. He was the deputy chief of the Malay military administration, and he was essentially in charge of Malaya from March of 1942 to March of 1943.
I was impressed by what I witnessed in China, such diligence, business sense, cohesiveness, independence, and a general will to live. The Malayan Chinese reflect so much of that same potential I saw in the mainlanders. I almost fear for what that potential might mean to Japan's forces.
In short, that just meant that they were afraid of us. They saw what we could do in China, and they saw that many Chinese were actually pouring funds into Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime and Mao Zedong's Communist Party, and they were afraid that we would put up resistance here in Malaya too. And they weren't wrong about that because we did put up a fight. We formed the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, or the MPAJA, that was mostly dominated by Chinese communists. And we did cause a fair number of Japanese casualties, and we were messing up a lot of their operations here in Malaya. And so they decided on two really big, really terrible policies to put against the Malayan Chinese in order to quell this resistance. 17th February 1942. Operation Cleanup. General Yamashita orders the severe punishment of hostile Chinese. He calls it a strategic military plan to maintain security in Malaya. Some commanders take severe punishment as an order to arrest and try suspects fairly in a court. But others, like Watanabe, were not so kind in their interpretation. All 18 to 50-year-old Chinese males were to report to screening checks.
Do you have a tattoo? Weapon? Are your hands soft? Do you wear glasses? Do you look suspicious?
70,699 men were loaded into trucks.
You answered yes. You were all suspected of conspiring against the Japanese government.
There was no trial
And you were all guilty.
or any chance to say goodbye. On that day, the Japanese estimated that they killed 5,000 men, but the Chinese placed their estimates for this mass execution at 40,000. We will never know the real figures behind one of the largest massacres during the Japanese occupation of Malaya. One of the things that we do know is that this was motivated by fear. Fear for what the Chinese could do, fear for what we would do to the Japanese occupation, and how they might lose their hold over us. This was not enough for Watanabe. He felt that the Chinese had to truly learn their lesson. They had to do much more to atone for all the grievances they've caused to the Japanese.
I have induced the Chinese to lay down their lives and offer their wealth to Japan. Only after they have demonstrated genuine penitence am I prepared to save their lives and return their property. This is the essence that I derived from 10 years of my administrative experience ruling alien nationals.
That was a voice acting of something that Watanabe wrote down. And if you recall, Watanabe is the one who is running the Malay administration. And he really believed that he was right. He really believed that the Chinese had to pay for what they did to the Japanese. And so he created this committee called the Overseas Chinese Association. And he pulled together all these prominent Chinese leaders and he essentially forced them. He sat them down and he told them that if you want to continue having my protection, which in his eyes was just continuing to exist in Malaya, they had to pay him back. They had to pay the Japanese back with $50 million. They had to raise that amount and give it to the Japanese. And if they did that, they would be able to continue with this protection. And if not, well, they would have to pay back in other ways. And that usually meant their lives. The Chinese were left with no choice and were forced to conspire against their own. They had to take the livelihoods away from their own people to serve the Japanese. The people were forced to sell their houses, gold, and silver for rock-bottom prices just to make up the $50 million. But still, as much as they sacrificed, it was just not enough. In the end, they only raised $28 million. And I was reading through sources of what it was like to have to force your own people to give up money when they themselves were poor or starving. And here's an account that I got from Lim Boon Keng, narrated by a friend.
You must have thought I'm a disgrace. If I don't behave like this, they'll make me do all sorts of things, and I can't stand it. The only way I can shake them off is to behave like this. They can put my name down for anything they like, but I'm not functioning because I'm incapable and drunk most of the time.
He's had to employ really terrible methods against his own people in order to raise this money. And in the end, in order to raise the last 22 million, in order to pay back for this insane gift, so to say, to the Japanese, they were forced to take a loan from a Japanese bank called the Yokohama Specie Bank at a 6% interest rate. And they would have to pay back this debt over a long period of time. This was also not something that the Chinese would forget. As I was researching about my own people's history, I came across this article. It was a compilation of Japanese sources about their perspective of the Japanese occupation of Malaya. And what I found really interesting from this was that in all these documents that this man named Akashi Yoji was compiling, was that the Japanese were actually looking to cooperate with the Chinese. Their end goal was to have a self-sufficient Malaya. Remember, this year is 1942. Japan is embroiled deep in World War II and they're trying to create their Asian empire. They couldn't have their troops just stationed here or have to expend a lot of energy in order to keep this colony alive. So what they really wanted was to cooperate with the Chinese so that they would help to stimulate the economy and kind of just keep things running in the colony for them. So why did they engage in such hardline policies against the Chinese? It just really doesn't make sense. This is like the worst plan ever to get somebody to cooperate with you, especially if you don't plan to keep overseeing them for the rest of the time. Well, what it turns out that these documents also reveal is that the Japanese top commanders didn't actually know what Watanabe and the other military commanders were doing at the time. What kind of happened was that there were a few military commanders who interpreted these things wrongly according to the documents, and that only some of them were really pursuing these things. But reading these sources, I find it really hard to believe that that's the case, because these actions were so widespread, and for the Japanese to claim that these were all born out of ignorance is just sort of crazy. To me, it just seemed as though they didn't actually really care. They just did whatever it was that they wanted to do until the time came when they realized that these policies were backfiring on them. See, during the time, Malaya was rich in natural resources. I mean, we still kind of are, but back then we were mostly export focused, exporting out rubber and tin, and our food, we didn't really cultivate ourselves. It was mostly imported. But because we became a Japanese colony, a lot of countries didn't want to trade with us anymore, and that led to a lot of food shortages in Malaya. And that was the reason why they needed the Chinese, because the Chinese were everywhere. They were in a lot of different British colonies, and they had a lot of good relations with different countries, and this was what would help them get the trade relations to bring food back into Malaya. People began to starve, and we were forced to cultivate our own food in order to survive. And the Japanese did try to revive the economy. They had these crazy schemes in order to bring money back into the country. So they put up these posters in Malay, Chinese, and Japanese. And what these posters were essentially for the lottery. So one of it is all in green in big black letters, and it says Engo Saiken, which means the lottery to support war victims. And there was another one all in big gold letters called Konen Saiken, which was a lottery to revitalize the South. And what they were trying to accomplish with all these lotteries was to get people to put money into banks and to spend money and to basically give the Japanese the capital in order to re-stimulate the economy. And when that didn't quite work, they came up with this Grow More Food program where they gave plots of land to all the Malayans and told them to grow your food, feed yourself. But this still didn't really work, and the economy remained in shambles, food supply was still low, and in the end, thousands of Malayans died from malnutrition. And so I just kept looking for sources, and I was just reading through these other things, and I stumbled across this video series, and there was this man, a Chinese man. His name is Yap Seo-jin, and during the time he was still a boy. And he was really pissed off at the Japanese because of all the atrocities they were doing, and he decided that he would open up the fuel tank of one of the cars, and he threw a match in there, and the car exploded. He got caught, and he was about to be executed by one of the Japanese soldiers who found him. But it just so happened that there was another old Japanese lady who was passing by who managed to say something to the Japanese soldier that kind of saved his life. And I'll translate what she said here. He's not an anti-Japanese fighter. He was just being naughty. He's only 6 or 7 years old. He wouldn't know how to use a weapon. Please forgive him. Don't kill him. Please retreat back. Let's not make a big deal out of this. Show some mercy. Why kill him? That Japanese woman managed to save Yap Seo-jin's life. And as I was researching this is not the only story that I found that showed kindness from the Japanese end. And I felt that this act of kindness is just as much a part of the story of the Malayan Chinese as all the other atrocities. I wanted to tell you a story about my people. I wanted to tell you a story about the Malaysian Chinese. We were feared and subdued, how we were pitied and saved, and how we suffered and survived. And this is only one chapter.